this week's Parsha is considered one of the most loaded with mitzvot Parshiot. The weekly reading Ki Tetze has a lot of different mitzvahs on all kinds of topics. Some midrashim generally bring 3 Parshiot in the Torah that have a lot of mitzvot, and this is one of them. I wouldn't be surprised if this particular Parsha has more mitzvot than any other, but there is no one objective way of counting the mitzvot. First of all, there are disputes about which mitzvot are considered separate mitzvot in 613. And secondly, even more importantly, some mitzvot in the Torah are mentioned more than once, and there's a question of how to count and which parsha to associate them with. So therefore, I wouldn't be able to tell exactly if Parshat Ki Tetze has more mitzvot than, let's say, Parshat Mishpatim or Parshat Kiddushin, but at least it's one of the candidates, and very possibly it does have more mitzvot than others. But what I noticed, and this is a question I posed to myself, and I'm going to share with you some of the research that I did, and that is which mitzvah in the Torah has more chapters in the Shulchan Aruch that are learned from it. Of course, by the chapters in Shulchan Aruch, I don't mean that every chapter is fully dependent on a particular verse in the Torah. What I mean is an example, and we'll see it in this week's Parsha, we have the verse from which the laws of Gittin, the laws of Jewish divorce, are learned. How a Jew can divorce, a man can divorce his wife. And the laws of Gittin are only mentioned here. And the chapters of Gittin in Shulchan Aruch are, of course, very many. They're not fully learned just from this verse. Some of it is learned from the verse, some of it is rabbinical tradition, some of it is purely rabbinical laws, but I still count it all as one full pack and parcel, if you could call it, based on that verse. So therefore, the question loosely defining this would be, if we look at the entire Shulchan Aruch, the main code of Jewish law, the mitzvot that apply to us today, and we specifically consider those mitzvot that have many chapters in Shulchan Aruch, not 1 or 2 chapters, but are covered by Shulchan Aruch significantly. Then I want to know what part of Shulchan Aruch and how many different mitzvot in this week's Parsha in particular are described in Shulchan Aruch in many chapters. And on that, I think we could answer more or less. Even though, of course, it's not fully fair to just count the number of chapters, because some chapters are longer, some chapters are shorter. For instance, Shulchan Aruch describes the entire laws of Pidyon Bechor, redeeming the firstborn, in just one chapter, 305th chapter of Yoradeh. But for instance, laws of Chala are spread over many chapters. But it could have been the opposite. You could put all the laws of Chala in one chapter and split the chapter of dealing with the Pidyon Bechor into many. So still, I think it does tell us quite a lot. If we could go through the mitzvot that are in this week's Parsha, that are covered by many chapters in Shulchan Aruch, to some extent or another. As we'll see in a moment, it's sometimes going to be a little bit loose as to whether to consider the entire set of these chapters to be related to a mitzvah or not. I'll give examples of this too. At any rate, there still comes out to be a very significant number of laws in Shulchan Aruch that are based on this week's reading. So the first one I want to discuss is Orach Chaim. Where in Orach Chaim do we learn laws based on our weekly reading? One might answer that none of the laws. There's no laws of Shema, laws of Birkat Hamazon, laws of praying, laws of Shabbat and Yom Tov. So the first section of Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, seems to be not having any parts of our Parsha at all. And yet it's not true. A very significant number of laws that cover the laws of where you're allowed to pray. You're not allowed to pray in places that are smelly, in a bathroom, for instance, or when the person praying or people in front of him are naked. All of these things are learned from this week's Parsha. The verses specifically say about a Jewish camp during the war, it has to be holy, and people shouldn't go to the bathroom right in the middle of the camp. They have to have a special place where they go. So, from the words, "V'yaya machanecha kadosh, v'lo yira'eh lecha ervat davar," those are the verses, the words of the Torah, based on which the Shulchan Aruch brings something like 15 chapters. Basically, the entire section of Orach Chaim at the end of Laws of Kriya Shema from 73rd to 87th. It's all based on these verses. Now, in the section of Yoredeh, as we'll see in the section of Choshen Mishpat, and especially in the section of Even HaEzer, there are a lot more laws based on this week's Parsha. In fact, almost the entire Even HaEzer is based on our Parsha one way or another. At least those laws that are biblical. So let me discuss some of these examples. As I mentioned earlier, the words of the Torah that discuss how a person divorces his wife, v'katav la sefer kritot, v'natan biyada. He will write what we call get, a book, a letter of divorce, and given to her hand. That is the law on which the entire laws of Gittin are based. And the laws of Kiddushin also learn from the same verse. Plus a number of other verses. The biblical Kiddushin is not exactly the same as marriage in English. Marriage would be more equivalent to chuppah. Today we do these two things together. A chatan, a groom gives usually a ring to his future wife and makes her betrothed, and then immediately he is done under the chuppah, and he immediately after that he makes her his wife fully. But the concept of chuppah, even though the idea itself is biblical, the Torah clearly distinguishes between engagement and full marriage, Kiddushin and chuppah. Yet, the word chuppah and the actual meaning of chuppah today is not exactly biblical. Meaning, the chuppah, usually what we call chuppah today, is a kind of little canopy where, in a sense, he symbolically brings her into his house. That's apparently the idea of biblical chuppah. That the nisuim, the marriage, according to the Torah, is after the future husband and wife are engaged. The next stage is marriage, when he brings her into the house, and this is done symbolically under the chuppah. The truth is, technically, there are a lot of different opinions what chuppah is. But what we call chuppah is the actual tent today. And then usually the yichud room. Ashkenazim do it immediately, the Sephardim do it a little bit later. But the idea is that they actually come into a special room and nobody else enters there. And that's the full chuppah with yichud, with the idea that now they're married for sure, according to all opinions. So whatever the case may be, certainly the Kiddushin and the get is in this week's Parsha. The chuppah, like I said, is not really openly stated, but you could say it's based on what's discussed in this week's Parsha. And certainly ketubah, while the main idea of ketubah is hinted in Parshat Mishpatim, you could say that the amount of ketubah, the biblical ketubah of 50 shekalim, which is 200 dinars, that's based on this week's Parsha. There is, of course, a dispute if the concept of ketubah is biblical or rabbinical, but according to the opinions that it's biblical, at least it's partially based on this week's Parsha. So we could say that almost the entire Even HaEzer, the section that deals with men and women, all these laws are based on this week's Parsha. Of course, the end of Even HaEzer deals with Yibum and Chalitza, the case when somebody dies without children and a brother performs either Yibum or Chalitza. All of that is in this week's Parsha, and that's many chapters as well. So basically, most of Even HaEzer is based on this week's Parsha, and in particular, Kiddushin, Gittin, and Yibum and Chalitza are based completely and totally on only the laws of this weekly reading. Okay, let's get to the Choshen Mishpat. One of the sections in Choshen Mishpat that's particularly based on this week's Parsha, even though it is not the only place in the Torah where some of these laws are discussed, but this is the main place. And that is the laws of returning an aveda. If you find something and somebody else lost, returning a lost object. This is in Choshen Mishpat, chapters 259 to 271. So that's quite a number of chapters, more than 10 chapters, just on the laws of Hashavat Aveda, and they're based on the verses in this week's Parsha. At last, last but not least, the laws of many different laws in Yoreh De'ah. Yoreh De'ah is the most diverse section of Shulchan Aruch. I specifically chose this order now that I'm talking about Yoreh De'ah last, because Yoreh De'ah includes all kinds of laws that are miscellaneous in a certain sense. The other three sections of our main code of law have mostly one topic. Even HaEzer is the laws between men and women, the Choshen Mishpat is business laws, and Orach Chaim is the laws of everyday life, as well as Shabbat and Yom Tov and holidays and various types of fast days. So it's the cycle of the year. And what's left is Yoreh De'ah. So which laws of Yoreh De'ah are hinted in this week's Parsha, or fully discussed in this week's Parsha? Well, first of all, for prohibition of taking interest. It's not only in this week's Parsha, but it is mentioned in this week's Parsha. And of course, that's in Shulchan Aruch, in Yoreh De'ah section 159 through 177, almost 20 chapters. Another section of Yoreh De'ah that's based on this week's Parsha is the laws of Shaatnez. Also, quite a number of chapters are discussing these laws, and that's in this week's Parsha. Don't wear wool and linen together. The clothing cannot have wool and linen together. I think that the laws of burial and mourning can, to some extent, be related to this week's Parsha. Now, the laws of burial are generally considered rabbinic, but they're based on biblical verses about the burial of the criminal who was executed, that he has to be buried the same day. And that's in the beginning of this week's Parsha. And of course, in Yoreh De'ah, these laws, together with the laws of mourning, which are generally rabbinical also, that entire section is huge. It's from basically 340, chapter 340 to 403, the end of Yoreh De'ah. It's entirely discussing that. Now, the main laws of oaths and vows is, of course, in Parshat Matot, but there is a little bit in this week's Parsha as well, a few verses on this topic. And of course, in Yoreh De'ah, we have quite a number of chapters, 30-something chapters, that deal with those laws. So to summarize all of this, we see, and maybe I missed some things because this Parsha is so long and has so many mitzvot, but just some of the things that come to mind from the mitzvot that apply to us today, and I mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. Of course, not all of the laws of the Torah apply to us today. In the previous Parsha, for instance, we had the laws of the king, and that he cannot have too many horses, he should write himself a Sefer Torah. All of those laws don't apply to us today. And there are many examples of this. But in this week's Parsha, first of all, majority, I would say, the vast majority of the laws apply to us today. So they are somewhere in Shulchan Aruch. And quite a number of them actually are covered by many chapters of Shulchan Aruch. So I think that, especially if we consider some of the laws that are somewhat loosely related, like the laws of burial and mourning, as I mentioned, that's not exactly in this week's Parsha, but at least the law of burial of the dead is mentioned. Some actually say that burial of the dead is a biblical mitzvah in all cases. But mourning, certainly all the laws of mourning are rabbinical, but at least it's loosely related to the verses. So we could say that if we take all of this together, a large part of Shulchan Aruch, maybe a quarter of Shulchan Aruch, or a little bit less than that, is all hinted in this week's Parsha one way or another, related to this week's Parsha. Certainly in terms of Even HaEzer, as I said, almost the entire section of Even HaEzer is based on the verses of this weekly reading. And if you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.